The bald one returns, apparently. I'm excited to be here. I have renewed energy and passion. I was talking to Derek Ewan a week or two ago, and I'd already written 3 or 4 of the sermons, and I said, dude, I'm so excited about this study. And he said to me, it was cool, because I've been reading a lot of commentaries for a year. While we were going through our study in Luke, I was preparing studies in Luke and really studying the book of Acts. And Derek said, that is what I've been waiting for. And I said, what? He said, that excitement and passion over this study. I'm very excited about it. You may not be very excited in about 35 minutes. We'll see how you feel. And if you're not, I don't want to hear about it. I'm going to attempt something I've never attempted this morning. And is Vino still in here? Vino. Women have a term. It's called man ears. And so what that means is when we don't listen and we just say totally the wrong thing. So I'm going to do just the opposite of what Vino said I was going to do. I'm not going to do anything in the book of Acts this morning. So rather than cover the entire book of Acts, I'm going to cover the entire rest of the Bible this morning in 35 minutes. I have this weird habit of doing an intro to the intro every time I start a study, and anybody that knows me knows I can't just introduce something, I have to introduce the way I'm going to introduce something. And so, if you're newer here and haven't been here the last 2.5 years, this I think will be helpful. If you have been here and you have the attendance record of most Creeksiders twice a week, or twice a month, you basically almost have earned your free sandwich card, and so you'll have missed big pieces. And so we're going to do a big study. It's a fascinating thing to me, what has transpired over millennia. And what we're going to do this morning is something that people of God have done for millennia. And when they do it, and I can give you some answers as to why, but I think there's a mystical piece behind this. When they do what we do this morning, when they did it, things went really well for Israel. And more often than not, they did not do what we're going to do this morning, and things did not go very well. Moses did this. In fact, almost the entire book of Deuteronomy is Moses doing what we're going to do this morning. When Joshua entered the Promised Land, Joshua did what we're going to do this morning. Jeremiah and Isaiah did it. Ezra, when he returned from, brought the remnant back from Babylon, Ezra did it. The priest did it. Josiah, when the southern part of Israel had fallen apart, they literally lost the Torah scrolls. And his priests were digging around in the Temple Mount, and they found the scrolls, and he ripped his shirt. He was so upset that they'd gone this far away from God. Josiah did what we're going to do this morning. When the angels met the women coming out of the tomb after Jesus' resurrection, the angels did it. And Jesus himself, on the very day of his resurrection, walking to Emmaus with 2 dudes that were very confused, did exactly what we will do this morning. And we will see that it's done over and over and over in the book of Acts. Peter does it, Stephen does it, Paul does it, and does it, and does it, and does it. And so I hope you will turn your brain on this morning. And I'm not going to worry about what you get from this. That will be God's problem. I'm just going to do what I think God wants. So, Tammy, are you ready for this? Let's go to the first slide. We talked 2.5 years ago about what the point of the Bible is. What is the point of the story? And what we said was, the story of God is about really 2 things. The Bible is not a collection of just a bunch of little faith epitaphs or a bunch of rules to follow. The Bible is a story. It's a single contiguous story that explains to us who God is and then how he wants to relate with us. It is not, for example, a science book. If you're going to the Bible, I was told this growing up, and I don't buy this now, the Bible is not here to answer every one of your questions. I don't think that's why the Bible was written. I think there's a lot of questions not answered in the Bible because that's not the goal of the Bible. The story of God is to explain him and how he wants to connect with us. And I hear this quite often too, that the goal of our life is to serve God. I completely disagree with that statement. And I hear it all the time. I think you would agree with me. God could do a lot better than you or I if he wanted to really, really get a servant. He could create a robot that would never make a mistake, and he'd be just fine with it. But to track with what my other beautiful bald friend Jeff Clipmus has been saying for 3 weeks, we are created out of an extension of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. It is about relationship. That is what it's about. So the whole story of God is about seeing how the Trinity digs each other, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and how you and I are an extension of that very thing. Not only in how we relate back to God, but how we relate with one another. Next slide. And we said in that study 2.5 years ago that there's 3 key words that really explain the story. The 3 words are kingdom, covenant, and glory. Next slide. And really what God's goal is, his goal is to fill the entire earth with his glory. This word glory sounds so big. All it means is to be seen accurately. That God wants to be seen for who he is in his Trinitarian life. The 3 of them in love with one another. And he wants to do that by reigning over a kingdom of people that have this connection with him, this covenant relationship with him. Go to the next slide. And what we said when we embarked on this study 2.5 years ago is that the story is like a giant play. It's got a bunch of acts, not the book of the Acts of the Apostles, but acts like a play. And within each of those major acts, there are scenes that break up each of those acts. And when we get to the book of Acts, we'll be in act number 7, if you will. So we will attempt to breeze through the first 6 acts this morning. The first act, act number 1, is usually referred to as the prologue. It seems like a lousy way to term it because there's so much going on, but we'll call it the prologue. And in act 1, there are 5 particular scenes: creation, the fall, Cain's sin, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And it really is the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Go to the next slide. And in this first scene, which Jeff has been describing for 3 weeks, we have creation. We have the Trinity saying, this is so dang fun together, we've got to do more of this. And that's what you and I are about. And we have the first of the 5 main covenants in the Old Testament. It's called the Adam covenant, or the Adamic covenant, where God meets with Adam, and he has this covenant, and he says, first of all, I want you to be fruitful and multiply, I want you to fill the earth, and I want you to subdue it. And there's really 2 ideas here. This whole idea of being fruitful is not just like, I want you to have kids. That's not what this is about. I want you to replicate the Trinity. That's what I want. I want the kind of fruitful relationship going on that the 3 of us had replicated through us. And I want you to do it as my under kings and queens. I want you to rule this place like I would, in peace and benevolence and love, and in the extension of what God's glory is really like. Go to the next slide. And this introduced to us then the first of 4 threads that kind of get woven through the tapestry of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's the most important of all the threads, I think. In fact, it's maybe the most important thing we can take out of this morning. This idea that Jeff again has been talking about for 3 weeks, this idea that we're made in God's image. We reflect God. Nothing else in creation reflects what the Trinity is like except for you and I. We are an extension of the Trinity. Every time my wife and I love each other, we look like the Trinity. Every time one of you takes care of one another, loves one another, we are reflecting the image of God. People are seeing what God is like through you and I. Go to the next slide. Unfortunately, we know what happened with Adam and Eve's sin, and that is the second piece in Genesis 3. And what it introduces to us is this whole idea of autonomy. The word I comes in. The whole idea of choosing yourself then as the source for life. I know I don't need God to make my life work. I will make it work. It's self-initiating. It's self-directing. You can hear in all these self-words. The only thing you don't hear in those is relationship. Everything about this autonomy and the sin that is created is about me. And nowhere in the Trinity do we see this, which is why it is so kind of completely disgusting. Go to the next chapter. And so then we have Cain's sin. And in Cain's sin, what we see, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, is sin is not just with Adam and Eve now. It is being passed on to their kids. And we see this with Cain. Can you see if you can get that? There you go. That'd be great. I want to make sure I get a tan while we're doing this. Go to the next slide. And that leads us into scene 4, which is the flood. And the whole idea of the flood, it's a little like uncreation, where not just Adam and Eve have sinned, not just Cain, but an entire society has fallen. And God, it says, remembers Noah. And he steps into this scene with Noah. And he wipes the whole thing clean. And basically with one guy like he did with Adam, he starts all over again. Next slide. And in this scene with Noah, God has the second of the main covenants of the Old Testament. It's called the Noachic covenant, or the Noah covenant is another way to say it. And it's really the same covenant, but God adds a really essential piece to this, which is, I'm never going to do that again. That just felt horrible. I created you to extend the Trinity. I created you to replicate me and to be an image of me, and you won't do it. But I don't want to start over again like that. It felt so awful to God, in other words. Not that he did the wrong thing, by any stretch of the imagination. And we go to the next slide, and we have the final scene of Act number 1, which is the Tower of Babel, which is a really significant scene in the story. And what we have here is roughly a time period of 350 years after the time of Noah. Noah and his kids are still alive, by the way, during the Tower of Babel scene. In fact, there's a possibility that even Abraham was alive during this scene. And what we find is, after 350 years, we're right back where we started from, right in the toilet. It's almost like the scene right before the flood all over again, where society is just into autonomy again. It's all about me, and it's not about God, and we're not reflecting the Trinity. And really what we get introduced here in the Tower of Babel, before we move on to the second act, is the idea of two kingdoms colliding. Two kingdoms that run side by side. The kingdom of Satan, the kingdom of this world, and the kingdom of God at enmity with one another. The next slide. And that introduces us then to act number 2. The longest of all the acts in this huge play, perhaps the most significant in a lot of ways, because what we find here is God stepping into the story. And what happens in chapter 12 of Genesis, where this scene starts, and it runs for quite a while, is the story just completely goes into super slow-mo. And you can see this where creation of the planets takes, for example, 10 words. You get to Abraham, and there's 13 and a half chapters. God just completely pulls back. Are you with me on this, Tammy? Okay, perfect. Next slide. Are you with me? Am I going too quick? I'm going faster than you? We may need to go get lunch after this, Tammy. There, now you've read that. Go to the next slide. And then this second act, what God is going to do to redeem mankind is God is going to build a nation. This is God's solution. It doesn't matter whether you think it's smart or I think it's smart. It is, because this is God's solution. This was God's way of saying, I'm going to step into it. And there's a big difference between what God does with Abraham and what God does with Noah. Noah is God's way of preserving the earth and preserving mankind. That is not Abraham's role. Abraham's role is to redeem mankind. It's a radically different thing that God is going to do. And so in chapter 12, which is arguably, in my opinion, the most significant chapter in the entire story of God, we see God heavily stepping into this story and solving it. That he's going to go from one man, Abraham, he's going to build a nation by which he wants to fix mankind and fix what is broken. And in chapter 12, God asked Abraham to do 3 things. Leave your country, leave your relatives, everything you know, and leave your dad's house. And I want you to go somewhere that I'm not going to tell you where it is. And Abraham, it says, just went. This single act of faith of Abraham. One guy decides to just take God at his word, and literally God completely enacts his redemptive plan for the earth. This single act of faith is literally what brings Jesus to us. It's an extremely heavy thing. Abraham, at 75 years old, roughly 4,000 years ago, trusts God. Next slide. Somebody wave at me if we're not in sync between behind me and in front of me. And we have the first scene in act number 2 of building a nation. God starts somewhere, and he starts with this guy Abraham. And what he does is he does another covenant. He's had the covenant with Adam. He's had the covenant with Noah. Now we have the Abrahamic covenant, where God basically promises him 5 things. I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give you a nation. You're just one guy, trust me, you're not going to have just a bunch of kids. You're going to have an entire nation, the Jewish race that will come after you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to curse anybody that doesn't bless you and curses you. And then the last, which we'll camp on the most heavily, God says, then I'm going to use your nation, my promised people, my covenant people that I'm going to bring to my chest, if you will. I'm going to use you to bless the world. You're going to be light. That's what Jesus said. He said, you be salt to each other, but you be light to the world. That's what he told us in the book of Matthew in chapter 5. That's what he said to Abraham. You're going to bless the nations. Go to the next slide, will you, Tammy? And that introduces us to another thread. I probably skipped one. One is this idea of the sins, where sin is always moving. It never stops. It is like a metastasized cancer. Sin always goes from a person to society. Don't ever be fooled by the fact that you think you're going to do something wrong on your own, and as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. There is no it doesn't hurt anybody else. Sin does not work that way. Every sin hurts somebody else. That's why it's called sin. It's a metastasized cancer. It never stops. And this idea of Israel and the nations, God has always been about Israel and the nations. If we don't get this, we really don't get the story. God wasn't about the Jews in the Old Testament and the Gentiles in the New Testament. That's horrible theology. We are not living in the age of the Gentiles right now. That's horrible theology. It's weird. I feel like in a rock concert. It's not Peter's fault. We got some bugs. God has always been for his people Israel and always been to bless them and then have them be a blessing to the rest of the world. Next slide. So already we've gone from creation to the fall, to sin moving, to uncreation, to recreation with Noah. He fills the earth and he picks one guy, and God is now on the move to build a nation. Go to the next slide if you can, Tammy. And in scene number 2, God now is going to move from this one guy. And Isaac has a son. And Abraham has a son, his name is Isaac. And then Isaac has a son, his name is Jacob. Jacob ends up getting his name changed to Israel. That's where we get the name Israel from. The word Israel means one who wrestles with God. This is a cool thing to God, by the way. This is faith. When you say, God, I'm wrestling with something, why don't I have faith? God is saying that is actually what faith is. The rest of the world walks around ignoring God, thinking nothing of him. When you wrestle, God says, thank you for having faith and wrestling with me. This is what he named his entire nation after. And Israel, or Jacob, has 12 sons, and they eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. This takes up the rest of the book of Genesis from chapter 12 to chapter 50. Next slide. This slide, real quick, we won't spend much time on this, but these are the 12 sons, Reuben and Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Benjamin. These become the 12 tribes of Israel. The one key tribe to mention in all of these is Levi's tribe, because they're the priests. They're specifically to be priests to the rest of the tribes, the 11 tribes. Next slide. And immediately what happens by the end of Genesis, or the formation towards the end of Genesis, is God is now going to build a nation. He wants to go from just a bunch of tribes to actually building a nation. And many of us know the story. What happens is a bunch of the brothers are a bunch of louses. They sell one of the youngest brothers, Joseph, into slavery. He ends up going down south to Egypt. He grows and grows and grows in stature. He eventually becomes the number 2 most significant man in Egypt, and there's actually historical proof for some of this. It's fascinating. He reports to Pharaoh himself. There's a famine in the land. They don't know what to do in Israel. They actually move down, these 12 tribes move down to Egypt, and they stay there, and they stay alive. Joseph, basically, because of the way he handled this famine, keeps this family alive. God keeps them alive through Joseph. And he grows them into a nation inside of a nation. So it's a very cool thing. It's a very important step in what God is doing. I mean, they grow to some 2 million people while they're living in Egypt, under Egypt. And so we move on from there. And then what happens? What happens is there's a Hebrew guy. He's tossed into a basket to keep him alive so he's not enslaved with the rest of his people. He grows up in Pharaoh's house. His name is Moses. He eventually figures out he's Hebrew. We're not really told how. He sees some atrocities going on. He tries to step in. He makes a little bit of a murderous faux pas. He ends up getting kind of kicked out of the country, and he goes out into the country for 40 years to live with his father-in-law, Jethro. And I want to read these verses. Are we there? Yeah. Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, that's the Pharaoh, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. Now listen to this statement. So God heard their groaning. This is 430 years later, by the way. And God remembered, listen to what he remembered, his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel and took notice of them. God remembers Genesis 12. His promise was, I'm going to save this world through a nation, through Israel. First, I have to build them. And that's what he's doing. So what looks like a funky deal where they're enslaved down in Egypt is actually God stepping in and actually growing them into a people group. It was one of the 5 promises he had made to Abraham. Go to the next slide. I'm going to check myself to see if I'm leaving out anything super important. The 5th scene in this is God actually delivering Israel. You know the scene. God actually goes to Moses. Moses is out in the wilderness with Jethro for 40 years. It's the coolest thing that's never been written about, because I don't know what happened, but Moses is growing up. Moses is being discipled by God and discipled by his father-in-law Jethro. And God, you know the scene, he meets him in the burning bush. Moses makes every excuse that he can think of not to do this. God still goes with it and lets his brother Aaron go with him. He ends up going back to Pharaoh 10 different times and saying, you really should let my people go. Every time Pharaoh stiffens his neck and God throws another plague at him. And it culminates, as we know, in the great plague of the firstborn children dying. And so what God has the Israelites do is kill an unblemished lamb, foreseeing Jesus. They take the blood of the lamb, they put it on the doorpost. The angel of death passes over, sees the blood on the doorpost, passes over, that's where we get Passover from, and does not touch the firstborn in this household. And so finally Pharaoh goes, yeah, I guess that's kind of enough. Go ahead and leave. They leave. God parts the Red Sea. They go to the Red Sea. It gets buried on Egypt. You know how the whole scene works. And now we have a nation built of 2 million people with nowhere to stay, but they're out in the wilderness. And they basically head towards Sinai. Did I get it all in that one? I have no idea. Let's go to the next slide. And what we have is we have 3 months of traveling down to the Sinai, and then they park in the Sinai. And this is where God meets them in the Sinai, Mount Sinai. He says this, Moses went up to God, up on the hill, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, meaning the house of Israel, tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be, and he tells them several things, you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is a phenomenal set of statements. He said, first of all, for all of the earth is mine. God has not lost this thought of Israel and the nations. God is going to use Israel to reach you and I. The second thing he tells them is, you're going to be a kingdom of priests. This is odd. The Levite tribe in the country of Israel, of all the 12 tribes, they were the priests. But what God says to them, even though they've got a priestly role, you're all priests of this world. Israel, you are my priests. You are going to reach mankind for me. And he calls them a holy nation, like God, like the Trinity. You're made in my image. You're holy to me. You're relational. Live this part of your life out. So after 430 years with 2 million people, the problem is they're very Egyptian. When they received the Torah at Mount Sinai, it's almost like getting the Constitution on steroids. They don't know who they are anymore. They're really Egyptian. They've lived in Egypt for 430 years. They know no other custom than that. Just a side note, a third of the book of Exodus is about building the tabernacle for the temple. Because this is what Israel is about. Union with God, worship of God, connection with the Trinity. So a third of this book is for this. They get down there at Mount Sinai after 3 months. They're there for a year receiving the Torah. I don't know if you knew how long they were there. They're free from the Egyptians. They have the full law now for their culture and governance. They have tons of folks, plenty to be a nation. They have a clear leader in Moses with Joshua as his apprentice. They have priests. They have the tabernacle for the temple. What are they missing? Say it out loud. Land. This is the only thing they're missing at this point. And this is why the story doesn't end. Next slide. This is the book of Exodus and Leviticus. These 4 scenes, by the way, if you don't know how those books fit in. Next slide. This next piece I will not even dignify as a scene, because you know what happens. They sin. They think Moses and God are taking too long. They sin. And what they end up doing is turning an 11-day trip to go into the Promised Land into a 40-year journey. I will not refer to this as a scene. It's the delay between the scenes. And really, the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy are really explaining this delay, this 40-year delay that should have been 11 days. The book of Numbers is really horribly named in English. It means wandering. It's perfect. The book of Deuteronomy means second reading. And what happens is they get just on the precipice of the Promised Land over what is modern-day Jordan. And Moses then begins to do what we're doing this morning. He retells the whole story over and over and over in the book of Deuteronomy and says, if you forget this story, you'll be doomed. Which is, I think, a warning to you and I today. We must stay close to the story. Then there's this weird deal where while they're wandering for these 40 years, they end up grumbling 10 times against God. It actually matches the exact number of plagues that God had enacted, to show you how sad the whole thing is. Next slide. So they stand on the precipice on that circle on the right. I don't know if you can read it, but it says Nebo. And you can stand there today and see most of Israel, the whole Dead Sea, and you can stare at Jericho where Joshua ended up entering. Go to the next slide. And we have scene 7, which is the entire book of Joshua, which is now Moses dies at Nebo, and Joshua takes them in. The whole book of Joshua is really about conquering the land for God. It's somewhere between 40 and 75 years. I'm not sure the exact time frame. Different scholars have different thoughts. That's what the book of Joshua is about. Taking the land down. Go to the next slide. And we get to scene 8, and it's really the idea of now that we're in the land, who gets the land? And they have to figure out which tribe gets which piece. And so really, the time of the Judges is a better way to say it, because it's not just the book of Judges, it's the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel is this 350-year time of the book of the Judges, where they're now trying to occupy the land that God has allowed them to conquer. Go to the next slide. And as you know, during the time of Judges, this 350 years, it's ugly, ugly, ugly. I had the beautiful time 2.5 years ago, or a year and a half ago, doing this on Easter. I don't know if I'll try that again, but 4 times in the book of Judges it makes this statement, and everyone did right in his own eyes. The significant difference now in the book of Judges, and in this time of the Judges, is you have 12 tribes. None of them work together. They all are taking care of themselves, so they're autonomous in their own tribes. There's no leader that leads the whole nation, so God will appoint a judge for them to help them make decisions, but never more than 1 or 2 tribes get together to fight somebody or to work something out. It's an extremely autonomous time that they find themselves in. There's 0 moral code. There's 0 spiritual code. There's 0 sense of being God's people. There's 0 unity. There's 0 leadership. There's 0 sense of the priesthood. And you get this sense of like, oh, we were so close. We were so close under Joshua. What happened? Israel is not blessing the world at this point. Israel, the redemption of God for mankind, is not coming through. God's reputation is being soiled by the way they're living for these 350 years. Go to the next slide. This will just give you a rough time frame. Adam to Noah, 1,000 years. Noah to Abraham, 1,000. The building of the tribes, roughly 250 years. The time in Egypt, roughly 400 years. Getting to Sinai, 3 months. Being in Sinai for a year. And then we have 40 to 70 years after the delay of actually conquering the land. And this time of the Judges now is 350 more years. We'll talk about why that's significant in a little bit. Go to the next slide. This is what Israel looks like, though. This is the tribes, and you can find their names. I didn't want to circle them, like Manasseh and Zebulun and Asher. You know, they're all there. Gad, Naphtali. Next slide. And in scene 9, nearing the end of the second act of God trying to build this nation to reach the world, this time of the Judges, we have several significant things taking place. This is where the prophetic office really starts. Moses was seen as a prophet, but Samuel then starts this almost like this role of prophet. Samuel is one of the most significant people in all of the Bible because he's the last judge during this 350-year horrible period of time, but he's also the first of the prophets, if you will, during this period of time. They already have a priest. They have land. They have the Torah. What seems to be missing from a national perspective? A king. Now, theologically, they're missing nothing because God is their king, which was the entire problem and where this heads next. Next slide. There's three main accomplishments under Samuel as the prophet. The first thing we find is it says, all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba. Dan is the farthest north you can get in Israel. Beersheba is a desert town as far south as you can get. You can go there today and see the ruins. Knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. This tells you we're coming out of the dark ages of the time of the judges. After 350 years, the country is having a sense of itself again. And they have a sense of one prophet that's over them. The other two main accomplishments during the time of Samuel were that God conquered the Philistines and brought peace to the land. And then the most significant is God restores worship again. They're coming to the temple. They're worshiping God as a nation, not just individuals. Next slide. The next three scenes, the final judge in Samuel, the monarchy and the theocracy, it starts in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and it covers the rest of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, parts of Kings, parts of Chronicles. And what's really significant here to mention is, as I mentioned, they thought they needed a king even though God was their king. And so they demand a king. We want to look like every other country. We want a king. God is deeply wounded by this. But he gives them a king. They pick the king that looks like a king, and his name is Saul, and he fails miserably. He sins 3 times against God, and God removes him. And he is what I would refer to as a monarchy, which is really a man-ruled government. Man's wisdom, man's military strategy, king's authority, the king's resources. And God picks David, this boy, and grows this boy up. And he loves God dearly. He wrote most of the Psalms, by the way. And in David, we have something that I would refer to as a theocracy, which is what you and I live in today with Jesus. It is a God-ruled kingdom through a human agent. God's wisdom, God's strategy, God's authority and power. And he meets with David, and he gives David this unique covenant, if you will. The David covenant says this: your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. Eventually, we know this as the kingdom that Jesus would reign in. Next slide. One of the worst slides of all, we have the end of building a nation. This divided kingdom, if you will. Solomon, David's son, comes along. He does well for a while, and then he decides that he would be autonomous too, and he would live life on his own. And he married a bunch of women, like a ton of women, like hundreds and hundreds of women, and they turned his heart away to foreign gods. And God ripped the nation in two through his sin. And so from here on in the story, when you read your Bible, you have you have 2 countries almost. You have Israel in the north, you can see that, and now what is referred to as Judah in the south. 10 of the tribes stayed with the north, 2 of them stayed in the south. And what's confusing when you read your Bible from this point on is you read about Israel, but it's not talking about all of Israel from this point. It's only talking about the north. And so when you understand that there's a split in the country, you'll know who these prophets are talking to. Next slide. Tim, you are just doing awesome. Thank you very much. That's just beautiful. And then we add one of the last of the 4 threads, from oppressed to oppressor. Solomon actually took people and made them slaves like Egypt did with his own people to build the temple, to build his palaces. So now what you have is the sad thing of Israel having been oppressed in Egypt, and now they're the ones that are actually oppressing humanity. Go to the next slide. I don't want to spend much time here, but this will give you a quick breakdown of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This will all be uploaded on the website, by the way. Go to the next slide. The one thing I didn't mention under Solomon that needs mentioning is the temple. God basically tells Solomon, you're going to get to build a fixed place temple. So they take the tabernacle and they put it within Jerusalem. I love when he dedicated it when Solomon said, this is where you get a sense that building a nation is working as redemption. Also concerning the foreigner, that means a non-Jew, by the way. Israel and the nations, God reaching out to the rest of the world, who is not of your people, Israel. when he comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand. Isn't that cool? God's reputation is glory being recognized. And of your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays the Gentile towards this house, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, God, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, to fear you as your people Israel does, and that they may know that the house which I have built is called by your name. The temple was the place on earth that you could come and meet God. The temple was the place on earth where you could come and find forgiveness. This Israel was becoming the redemptive plan on earth for God. This was God's plan in Genesis 12 with Abraham. This is why God spent all this time building a nation. 250 years to build the tribe. 400 years building them as a nation in Egypt. 500 years from the time they left Egypt. God has been faithful when you read this story. God never gave up. He's going to build a people that is going to redeem life. I want you to see in this story this morning how committed God is to what he promises you. Not what you can see from day to day, but what you see over millennia. This is why you and I need to know the story. We need to be pulled out of the mire of our minutes and lifted up into the grandeur and beauty of the millennia as God has strived to redeem our world. Oh, that it had ended here. Next slide. I'm not going to spend, well, yes we will. Yes we will. We have now two countries. We have Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Jeroboam runs the north. Rehoboam, just to make us really confused, runs the south. I remember him because J becomes before R. Never mind. Jeroboam in the north has a problem. He has no temple. It's in Jerusalem. He doesn't want his people in the north going down to worship God, so he says, no problem with that. I'll create my own holy places. He creates this one in Dan, and he creates another one in Bethel. And he turns the people's hearts away from God. These 10 tribes. Within 400 years, in 722 BC, the north falls to Assyria. 150 years after that, the south, Judah, falls to Babylon. It's a train wreck. What you should see in these last few slides is look what it took God, and look how faithful and patient he was to build this. And one guy, just in case you don't think your life matters, one guy decides to not take God at his word, Solomon. And the whole thing's a train wreck all over again. One guy decides to live autonomously and for himself. And God's redemptive plan is again seemingly put on hold. Next slide. This is the one I'm going to skip, even though it's very significant. But you can read these verses where this was all predicted in the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua reminded them all over again, and it's all happening exactly as God had warned them not to do. Next slide. So God will now move towards repairing this kingdom. Why? Because he's God. And he is still not done. He is going to fulfill his promise. These next 4 slides are perhaps impressionize some of the most important that I think we can look at this morning. I hear this all the time, and it just makes my skin crawl. Not in anger against people when they say this to me, because I know they don't have any sense of what the story says. When people say to me, God seems so different in the Old Testament than he does the New Testament, what that tells me is you don't know God from the story. Nothing could be farther from the truth. This is what I want you to see. I want you to see God spent a year trying to build this nation to redeem mankind. This first slide is fascinating. If you look on the left, I don't know if you can read it, but all it says is bad, very bad, the worst, mostly bad. Those are the kings of Israel. There wasn't one good king in the north. They were all abhorrent men that led their people away from God. He tolerated that for 400 years. This is our God. So if you say to me, God doesn't appear merciful in the Old Testament, then you don't know the story. Look look at the right side. The only reason they lasted longer is there's some goods and mostly goods, and God kept holding out hope. But 150 years later, they fell to Babylon. Go to the next slide, Andy. This is, you can't read this, but don't worry. The top is Israel, the bottom is Judah. All of those names on the top and on the very bottom, outside the lines, those are the kings. All of those people on the inside, those are prophets. Those are people that God sent to his people over and over and over again to beg them to come back to him so that their life wouldn't fall apart. Tell me God is not merciful. Next slide. These are the prophets. Joel, God sent him maybe 130 years since the time of Solomon. Amos was 140 years. Jonah, 150. They're not really positive on Jonah. Hosea, 180. Next slide. Micah, 190 years. Nahum, king, 207 years after the time of Solomon. Zephaniah, 290 years after the Solomon. You get the idea here. God just would not relent on saving his people. And then to have them save the world. Go to the next slide. This is fascinating if you want to know why I'm doing this morning. This is two verses that explain the difference between the north and the south. In the north, for many days, Israel was without the true God and without a teaching priest and without the law. They lost their sense of who they were. In the south, all Judah rejoiced concerning the oath, for they had sworn with their whole heart and sought him earnestly and let him find them. Boy, there's a scary warning to all of us. We have got to remember this story. That's why I don't care if you know why I'm doing this. I'm going to do this. It doesn't matter to me if it makes total sense to you why I will spend this much time reviewing the story. I want us to know this. Our life is more than the last day or two. We are to be caught up in the ground of what our faithful, loving God has been doing over millennia. Amen? Next slide. Unfortunately, in 722, I said Israel in the north falls. Those are the prophets that tried to help them out. By 612, Assyria falls to Babylon, and just shortly after that, in 586, 587, Judah falls to Babylon. All being warned by these prophets over and over by God. Please don't do this. Please don't do this. Please don't do this. They're in Babylon in the south for 70 years before they actually return to the promised land. This is what autonomy looks like. Just in case you're not familiar with it. Just in case you're not connected with when you live for yourself and what your life looks like. This is ugly, ugly, ugly. Next slide. I won't spend any time on this, but three of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Again, it's about the exile. It's God trying to keep them out of the exile, then God going through it with them in exile, and then when they're there, God meeting them there in exile. Just in case you don't think God's merciful in the Old Testament. He sits in exile with his people. Next slide. And this is a super important question back to Genesis 12. This is God's problem. God has boxed himself in, if you will. And I say that facetiously as if God has ever boxed in. God has made a promise. I will redeem the world through the seed of Abraham. Right? But this is his problem. How do I rescue Israel from itself while still doing it through Israel? Because Israel won't do it. This is a major problem. This is why the Bible kept going and going and going. Go to the next slide. This is why the book of Isaiah is so significant to us, particularly the middle book of Isaiah, where God says, I want to introduce to you the concept of a servant. It'll be an Israelite servant. And the servant is all kinds of people in this text. It's Israel, it's Cyrus, this king of Persia that frees them and lets them go home. It's Jeremiah, it's Isaiah. But central to who this servant is, this Israelite that will save Israel, is this suffering servant that God says he will bring, Messiah. Next slide. And two slides to say the same thing. Israel is God's servant, but Israel is broken. How will Israel redeem mankind if they're broken? God will bring a servant on Israel's behalf, but he's got to be an Israelite because God promised he would redeem the world through Abraham's seed. Next slide. Israel is to be God's people and ultimately a light to the Gentiles. Israel as a nation fails over and over. Individuals like Moses and and Joshua and Jeremiah and David, Elijah, Elisha. Over and over, individuals try to do it for Israel, but they can't pull it off. Now one is coming, God says. The Messiah will come along to do it. He'll be faithful Israel for Israel, and then a light to the rest of mankind. This is super significant that we understand this piece of the story. Next slide. And this is just some key dates. They get to return in 538. The temple's restored. The priest comes back and tells them the story. Nehemiah rebuilds the walls, but unfortunately, it's almost too little too late. Greece takes over again in 333, and this is really the end of God preparing this broken kingdom. Next slide. And we find ourselves in Act number 5, preparing. I'm going to have to move. One thing I want to mention in this Acts 5 is really the preparation for Messiah. It's the time between the Testaments. And the one significant thing that I want to highlight that God does during this time between the Testaments is He builds the synagogues. The synagogues get built to keep their identity alive. There's only one time in 800 years where Israel was not ruled by foreign domination. Go ahead, next slide. It's the time of the Maccabees. 25 years, that's it. Next slide. 800 years they're ruled by somebody else. And God basically is going to bring along a preparer of these people. Obviously, Rome took over. That third bullet is the key. That 800 years they're waiting, and finally God announces He's going to bring Messiah. Next slide. And we see this in the book of John. In the beginning was the Word was with God. This is Jesus that's speaking, that's being spoken of. The light shines in the darkness. There's the light to the world that God is going to bring, and the darkness did not comprehend it. The Word became flesh and blood and dwelt among us, and we saw His glory, the glory of the only begotten from the Father. I love the last statement. Those last 4 words are for my favorite words in the Bible. Jesus has explained the Father, is what that means. The Messiah will come. Next slide. And we know who the one to do this will be. It will be John the Baptist. Finally, the divine silence after 400 years is broken. There's no record between the Testaments of God speaking. Finally, an angel shows up. We have no record other than this of an angel ever speaking in the temple. He meets with John the Baptist's dad and says, finally, God will speak again. He's known as the Elijah figure. He is, as the Old Testament refers to John the Baptist, the breaker in, the great preparer for the one to come. Next slide. And that brings us into the Gospels. We spent the last year and 4 months looking at the birth and preparation. Jesus gathering and equipping Israel. And that's important I say it that way. Jesus was not coming to reach the Gentiles. Sorry to tell you that. He was coming to reform his nation. A new kingdom of Israel to reach the world. God was never going to forget, by the way, as if you thought He was. Genesis 12. He is being true to His covenant with Abraham. And obviously, finally, we have the passion, the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus rides in on the colt in that week, prophesied. At that moment, it's a millennial moment. If they receive their rightful king, they will actually enter into this millennial reign. But they refuse to do it. Jesus says it's a den of robbers. This is the place where people are supposed to come meet God, come find forgiveness. As the leaders, you're supposed to be listening to God, and you've not seen the hour of your visitation. I am the expected one, and you've missed me. Next slide. We'll close with some thoughts. That means we're almost done. Johnny, you can make your way out if you want. And let's do full worship. You guys will make it. You guys will go 5 minutes late, won't you? Yeah, I don't want to miss Johnny singing for us. Can you go to the next slide, Tam? I'm sorry, there we go. The 3 thoughts I want you to remember is, number 1, the existence of the Jewish people. They should not be here anymore. Why are they here? Mark Twain had this amazing quote. I don't want to read the whole thing, but I love this. If statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. The rest of his quote is, why are they still here? This was the greatest proof to Mark Twain of any other thing that God existed. They should not be here. Why are they here? Because they're God's promised people. Because God saw one guy that He really liked, Abraham, and that guy really liked him, and God never forgot. This is what God's like with you. Next slide, Tam. The second thing I want you to remember is how faithful God is to His covenant. Look what God has done. Look what He's put up with. Look how many times He reached out to mankind to save us. And He did it the way He said He would do it. He used an Israelite to reach Israel and the rest of the world. And when we get into the book of Acts, this is what's really cool. It's the Jews that come to faith in Messiah first. And then they go out. Paul, shockingly, was a Jew. Peter, shockingly, was a Jew. And they are light to the world. God builds his church, and he does it on the top of the synagogues that he sent out through the exile. We'll look at that more next week. And last one, the Messianic kingdom. We live and have for 2,000 years under the reign of Jesus. He is the king. We're not waiting for him to be king. He is king. But we live in this dualistic life where Satan rules this world. So if you say, why isn't it fair? Life's not fair. Well, guess what? You're right. Because Jesus isn't running this world. But you belong to Jesus if you acknowledge him as your Savior. Go to the next slide, Tammy. But when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once for all. And this is how we have redemption. This is what God has been working on for millennia for you and for me.